Mother abandons her blind daughter in a wheelchair with a furious horse. The ending will leave you. In a timeless village, nestled among vast pastures and dusty roads, 17-year-old Isabella lived a life unlike any other. From the moment of her birth, blindness had denied her the gift of light and colors, forcing her to construct her reality through sounds, scents, and touches. A childhood accident had further restricted her world, confining her to a wheelchair, making her universe limited to the walls of her house and the small backyard where she could feel the wind caress her face and hear the distant song of birds. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching from. Stay with us. Every morning, Isabella would wake to the same symphony of familiar sounds, the creaking of old wooden floors, the rustling of leaves in the backyard, and the distant echo of village life that seemed to exist in another dimension altogether. Her fingers traced the rough texture of her bedroom walls, a daily ritual that grounded her in her space, giving her a sense of security in her darkness. Aurora, her mother, was a woman whose face had been carved by disappointment and resentment. Raising a daughter with disabilities had never been part of her life's blueprint, and over the years, the weight of responsibility had transformed into a cold indifference. She had begun to view Isabella not as her daughter, but as an obstacle to her own freedom, a constant reminder of dreams unfulfilled. The young girl had grown accustomed to her mother's coldness, learning to find warmth in the smallest of things. The scent of freshly baked bread wafting from the street, the texture of dried leaves she collected from the ground, and the sound of rain against the roof that allowed her to imagine scenes she could never witness with her eyes. These simple pleasures became her sanctuary, a world she created within the confines of her isolation. Life in the village moved at its own unhurried pace, and Isabella's presence went largely unnoticed by the residents. Aurora rarely took her outside, preferring to keep her daughter hidden away like a secret she wished she could forget. The isolation had become routine, and Isabella, despite everything, never complained. She had learned to find beauty in the details others overlooked. The way the morning dew made the air feel crisp and clean, the subtle changes in temperature that marked the passing of seasons, and the various textures beneath her fingertips that told stories of the world beyond her reach. As the years passed, Aurora's coldness evolved into something more severe. The contempt she tried to disguise began to manifest in increasingly harsh gestures. Small incidents became more frequent, forgetting to bring food to her daughter or leaving her alone for long hours without explanation. Isabella never questioned these lapses, having learned early on that expecting understanding from her mother was futile. The village itself was a character in Isabella's story, though she experienced it differently from others. Through her window, she could hear the weekly market's bustle, the children playing in the distance, and the conversations that drifted up from the street below. Each sound painted a picture in her mind, creating a tapestry of life that she could never see but felt deeply in her heart. One particular morning brought a change to Isabella's carefully constructed world. The air felt different, charged with an unfamiliar tension. Aurora's footsteps seemed more purposeful, her movements more deliberate. Isabella sensed something shifting in their daily routine, but she couldn't identify what it was. The usual morning sounds were there, the birds, the distant church bells, the neighbor's rooster, but something else lingered beneath the surface, an undercurrent of anticipation that made her skin prickle. Aurora's voice, when she finally spoke, carried an edge Isabella had never heard before. "We're going on a journey today," she announced, the words falling like stones in the quiet room. Isabella's heart quickened at this unexpected declaration. In all her 17 years, they had never gone on a journey together. The concept itself seemed foreign, almost impossible. The preparation was swift and silent. Isabella felt herself being guided through familiar corridors, the wheelchair moving across well-known thresholds for what she didn't know would be the last time. The morning air outside was cool against her skin, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something that spoke of change and uncertainty. As they moved away from the house, Isabella tried to memorize every sensation, the way the wheels transitioned from wooden floors to earth, the gradually changing sounds of the village giving way to open space, the subtle shifts in temperature as they passed between sun and shade. She didn't know it then, but these would be her final moments of the life she had known. The journey continued, and Isabella began to notice unfamiliar sounds and scents. The clip-clop of horse hooves joined their journey, and the air grew thicker with the smell of hay and leather. Her world, already limited by her disabilities, was about to transform in ways she could never have imagined. As they traveled further from everything she knew, Isabella held onto the only thing she could control, her breath, steady and measured, keeping time with the rhythm of the wheels beneath her and the hoofbeats that seemed to be leading them toward an unknown destiny. The journey seemed endless as Aurora guided the cart through winding paths and unfamiliar terrain. Isabella felt every bump and dip in the road, her other senses heightened as they ventured deeper into unknown territory. The air grew thicker with the scent of dry grass and dusty earth, and the sounds of the village had long since faded into an eerie silence, broken only by the steady rhythm of horse hooves and creaking wheels. As they traveled, Isabella's mind wandered through memories of her life in the village. Despite the coldness she had endured, the house had been her sanctuary, a place where she had learned to navigate through darkness with practiced ease. Now, surrounded by unfamiliar sensations, she felt more vulnerable than ever before. The wind carried new scents, wild flowers, sun-baked earth, and something else, something primal that made her heart beat faster. Aurora remained silent throughout the journey. Her presence felt only through the occasional adjustment of the cart's direction. The silence between them grew heavier with each passing moment, filled with unspoken words and emotions that had festered over years of mutual isolation. Isabella wanted to ask where they were going, but years of experience had taught her that questions often led to harsher silences. The temperature began to change as the sun climbed higher in the sky. Isabella could feel its warmth on her face, more intense now without the protection of village buildings. The cart's wheels transitioned from packed earth to looser ground, and new sounds began to emerge from their surroundings. There was a rustling in the distance, different from the familiar sounds of the village, and the air carried the distinct scent of horses. Not just their cart horse, but others, several of them. The cart finally came to a stop in what felt like an open space. The wind moved differently here, unobstructed by buildings or trees, carrying with it the heavy scent of hay and leather. Isabella could sense the presence of something large nearby, hearing the powerful breathing and occasional stamping of hooves that suggested the proximity of a horse, one that seemed different from their cart horse. Without a word, Aurora began to move. Isabella heard her mother's footsteps circle around to her side of the cart, felt the familiar grip on her wheelchair as she was helped down. The ground beneath her wheels was uneven, covered in what felt like scattered hay and dry earth. The sound of breathing, that powerful, unfamiliar breathing, grew closer, accompanied by the heavy thud of hooves that spoke of a large, powerful animal. The atmosphere was charged with tension as Aurora positioned Isabella's wheelchair on the ground. There was a moment of stillness, broken only by the sound of that mysterious horse's movements. Then, without warning, without a single word of explanation or farewell, Aurora's footsteps began to retreat. Isabella heard them growing fainter, moving away with deliberate purpose, leaving her alone in this strange place. "Mother?" Isabella called out, her voice carrying across the empty space. No response came except for the sharp whinny of the horse nearby. The sound of retreating footsteps continued until they faded completely, leaving Isabella in a silence broken only by the powerful presence of the unknown animal before her. The horse's presence became more pronounced in the absence of all other familiar sounds. Its breathing was deep and resonant, its movements suggesting both power and restlessness. Isabella had heard stories about this particular horse, whispered conversations in the village about its unpredictable nature and aggressive temperament. Now she sat mere feet away from it, unable to see its movements, forced to rely on her other senses to gauge its intentions. Time seemed to stretch endlessly as Isabella remained motionless in her wheelchair, every nerve attuned to the sounds and movements around her. The horse's hooves struck the ground with impressive force, sending vibrations through the earth that she could feel even through her wheelchair. Yet something unexpected was happening. Instead of the aggressive approach she had feared, the horse's movements seemed curious, almost cautious. In the village, Helena, a perceptive woman who had always watched the dynamics between Aurora and Isabella with concern, noticed something amiss. The usual sounds of Isabella's presence in the backyard, the soft humming she did while feeling the sunshine on her face, the gentle creaking of her wheelchair, were conspicuously absent. Aurora's explanation about sending Isabella away for special treatment didn't sit right with Helena, especially given the hasty nature of the supposed departure. The horse's breathing grew closer, and Isabella felt its warm breath ghost across her face. Her heart raced, but not entirely from fear. There was something in the animal's approach that spoke of recognition, not of her specifically, but of something they shared. Perhaps it was their mutual isolation, their experiences of being misunderstood and feared. Whatever it was, it created a connection that transcended the barriers of species and disability. As the sun continued its journey across the sky, Isabella remained in place, her world expanding in unexpected ways. The horse's presence, initially threatening, began to feel like an anchor in this new reality. Its breathing took on a rhythmic quality that reminded her of the ocean waves she had once heard described. In this unlikely place, abandoned by the one person who should have protected her, Isabella found herself forming a bond with a creature that others had deemed dangerous. In the hours that followed her abandonment, Isabella discovered a world of sensations she had never known existed. The horse, which had initially filled her with terror, began to reveal a gentler nature. Its movements, though still powerful, took on a careful quality when near her wheelchair. The sound of its breathing became a constant companion, a rhythm that helped calm her racing thoughts and ground her in this unfamiliar space. With trembling fingers, Isabella reached out into the empty air. The horse's response was immediate, but gentle, a soft nudge of its velvet nose against her palm. The touch sent a jolt of surprise through her body, not from fear, but from the unexpected tenderness of the contact. This creature, which she had heard described as dangerous and unpredictable, seemed to understand her vulnerability and responded with extraordinary gentleness. As her fingers explored the horse's face, she discovered a map of textures: the softness of its nose, the coarse hair of its face, the smooth plane of its forehead. Each touch revealed more about her companion, and with each passing moment, her initial fear dissolved into fascination. When her fingers found a long scar running along its neck, she paused, recognizing in that rough tissue a story of past pain that echoed her own experiences. Meanwhile, in the village, Helena's concern grew stronger with each passing hour. Aurora's behavior had changed subtly but noticeably since Isabella's supposed departure. The woman who had always worn a mask of irritation when speaking of her daughter now seemed lighter, almost relieved. But there was something artificial about her demeanor that set off warning bells in Helena's mind. Walking through the village square, Helena overheard Aurora speaking to a group of neighbors. "The treatment facility is excellent," Aurora was saying, her voice carrying a false brightness. "They specialize in cases like Isabella's. It's really the best place for her." But Helena noticed how Aurora's eyes darted away when speaking these words, how her hands fidgeted with her apron in a telling gesture of discomfort. Back at the enclosure, Isabella began to understand the rhythm of her new environment. The horse's movements created a pattern she could follow, the heavy steps that meant it was walking away, the lighter sounds that indicated it was returning to check on her. She learned to anticipate its approaches by the change in the air current and the subtle vibrations through the ground. As the sun moved across the sky, warming different parts of her face, Isabella started to feel something shift within herself. The initial panic of abandonment was giving way to a strange sense of peace. Here, in this unlikely place, she felt none of the judgment or pity that had often colored her interactions in the village. The horse accepted her presence without question, without the weight of expectations or disappointment that had characterized her relationship with Aurora. Helena's investigation led her to the outskirts of the village, where cart tracks in the dusty road caught her attention. These weren't the usual marks of village traffic. They were deeper, suggesting a heavily loaded cart, and they led away from the main roads toward the old pastures. Following her instincts, she began to trace the path, noting how the tracks avoided the more populated areas of the village. The wind carried the scent of an approaching storm to Isabella's nose, and she felt the horse grow restless. Its movements became more purposeful, its breathing more intense. Then, something remarkable happened. The horse began to guide her wheelchair, gently nudging it with its nose, moving her toward what she would later discover was a sheltered corner of the enclosure. The connection forming between Isabella and the horse transcended their apparent differences. Both had been marked by life's hardships, she with her physical limitations, the horse with its reputation for being uncontrollable. Yet together, they were finding a way to communicate that required no words, no sight, only the pure language of trust and understanding. As evening approached, the temperature began to drop, and Isabella felt the first hints of uncertainty about spending the night in the open. But the horse remained close, its body heat providing warmth, its presence a comfort in the gathering darkness. She could hear its tail swishing, keeping away the flies that buzzed around them, and feel its occasional gentle nudges, checking on her well-being. In the village, Helena had begun to piece together the inconsistencies in Aurora's story. The timing of Isabella's sudden departure, the lack of any previous mention of a treatment facility, the way Aurora avoided discussing specific details, it all painted a picture that made Helena's heart heavy with suspicion. She knew she needed to act quickly, but she also understood the importance of being certain before making any accusations. The horse's scar became a point of connection between them. Whenever Isabella's fingers found that raised line of tissue, the horse would stand perfectly still, allowing her to trace its length. It was as if the animal understood that she was acknowledging their shared experience of pain and survival. In those moments, the boundary between human and animal seemed to dissolve, leaving only two souls finding solace in each other's presence. Helena's determination grew stronger as she followed the cart tracks leading away from the village. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty path, and every hoofprint and wheel mark told a story that contradicted Aurora's carefully constructed narrative. As she walked, her mind pieced together the subtle changes she had observed in Aurora's behavior over the past few days. The nervous energy, the elaborate explanations, the forced smiles that never quite reached her eyes. The trail led her through winding paths, past abandoned farmland and overgrown fields. Helena noticed how the tracks deliberately avoided the main roads, choosing instead the less traveled paths where curious eyes wouldn't follow. Her heart grew heavier with each step, understanding that these weren't the actions of a mother sending her child for treatment. These were the calculated moves of someone trying to hide their tracks. Back at the enclosure, Isabella had begun to develop an extraordinary connection with her unlikely companion. The horse's presence had become a constant source of comfort, its movements creating a dance she could follow without sight. She learned that 3 soft stamps of its hoof meant it was about to bring her water, nudging containers within her reach. The gentle brush of its mane against her arm became a signal that it was checking on her, making sure she was safe. Throughout the day, Isabella discovered that the horse had its own language of sounds and movements. A soft nickering meant all was well, while a sharp snort indicated potential danger, usually nothing more than a rabbit or bird, but the horse's protective instincts never wavered. This silent communication filled the void left by human speech, creating a bond that transcended traditional understanding. In the village, Aurora maintained her facade, but cracks were beginning to show. When questioned about the specific location of the treatment facility, she would change the subject or suddenly remember urgent errands. The villagers, initially accepting of her explanations, began to exchange worried glances behind her back. The whispers started slowly, like leaves rustling in a gentle breeze, but they were growing stronger. Isabella's fingers had mapped every inch of the horse's face and neck that she could reach, creating a picture in her mind of her protector. The scar she had discovered became a point of reference, a reminder that pain could heal and leave something stronger in its wake. When she touched it, the horse would lower its head, allowing her better access, as if understanding the importance of this connection they shared. The afternoon brought new challenges as the weather began to change. Isabella could sense the approaching storm in the way the air pressure shifted, in the increasing restlessness of the birds, and in the horse's changing behavior. The animal became more active, more purposeful in its movements. She felt it circling her wheelchair, its hooves striking the ground with determined precision. Helena's search led her to a remote area she hadn't visited in years. The old pastures, once thriving with livestock, now stood mostly abandoned. But as she approached, she noticed signs of recent activity: broken branches, disturbed earth, and most tellingly, fresh hoofprints that didn't match those of the cart horse. Her pulse quickened as she realized she was getting closer to uncovering the truth. As the wind picked up, carrying the first hints of rain, Isabella felt the horse's presence become more protective. It positioned itself to shield her from the strongest gusts, its body creating a windbreak that kept the worst of the weather at bay. The connection between them had grown into something remarkable, a partnership born of necessity but evolving into something far more profound. The horse's behavior changed subtly as the storm approached. Its movements became more deliberate, more focused. Isabella felt it gently nudging her wheelchair, guiding her with careful precision. She realized it was moving her toward shelter, using its understanding of the environment to protect her from the approaching rain. This display of intelligence and care brought tears to her eyes, tears that mixed with the first droplets of rain falling from the darkening sky. Meanwhile, Helena had reached a point where the cart tracks became clearer, leading toward an old enclosure she remembered from years past. The area had once been used for breaking in wild horses, though it had fallen into disuse. As she got closer, she could make out fresh marks in the earth, signs of recent activity that seemed out of place in this abandoned corner of their world. In the village, Aurora's carefully constructed story began to unravel further. A neighbor mentioned seeing her cart heading in the opposite direction of any known treatment facility, and another recalled Aurora purchasing supplies that seemed odd for someone whose daughter was supposedly away. Fresh hay, water containers, items that suggested a different truth than the one she had been telling. The storm clouds gathered overhead, casting deep shadows across the landscape as Helena approached the old enclosure. Each step brought her closer to a truth she could feel in her bones, a truth that had been hiding beneath Aurora's carefully crafted lies. The wind carried fragments of sounds, the creaking of old wood, the rustle of hay, and something else that made her heart skip a beat, the distinct sound of a horse's protective snort. In the enclosure, Isabella had found herself being guided by her newfound protector to a corner where the wind felt different. The horse's body heat remained close, a constant presence as the temperature dropped with the approaching storm. She could feel the vibrations of its movements through the ground, sense its determination to keep her safe. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing hour, transforming from fear into something approaching miracle. Thunder rolled across the sky, and Isabella felt the horse move closer, its body creating a protective barrier against the elements. The animal's breathing remained steady, calming, a contrast to the chaos of the storm brewing above. She reached out, finding the familiar scar beneath her fingers, drawing strength from this shared moment of vulnerability and trust. Helena paused at the edge of the property, her eyes adjusting to the gathering darkness. The rain had begun to fall in earnest now, but through the curtain of water she could make out shapes that confirmed her suspicions. A wheelchair, partially protected from the rain, and beside it the massive form of a horse, not just any horse, but the one known throughout the village for its untamable spirit. The scene before her defied everything she had heard about the animal. The horse, infamous for its aggressive behavior, stood guard over Isabella with a gentleness that seemed to transform its very nature. Helena watched, transfixed, as the animal adjusted its position to better shield the girl from the wind and rain, displaying an intelligence and compassion that brought tears to her eyes. Back in the village, Aurora's facade had begun to crack under the weight of her actions. Each time someone mentioned Isabella, her reactions grew more erratic, more desperate. The carefully constructed story of the treatment facility began to collapse like a house of cards in a storm, leaving behind questions that demanded answers. Isabella had learned to read the horse's movements with an accuracy that surprised even her. She could tell by the subtle shifts in its breathing when it was alert to potential danger, could sense through the pressure of its presence when it wanted her to remain still. This silent language they had developed transcended her blindness, creating a connection that went beyond sight. The storm intensified, but within their shelter, Isabella felt an unexpected sense of peace. The horse's warmth beside her, its steady presence in the face of the elements, created a cocoon of safety she had rarely experienced in her life. Even the thunder, which had always frightened her at home, seemed less threatening with her protector nearby. Helena moved closer, careful not to startle either Isabella or the horse. The rain had soaked through her clothes, but she barely noticed the discomfort. Her focus was entirely on the extraordinary scene before her, the gentle giant that had become an unlikely guardian, and the young woman who had somehow tamed it with nothing but her vulnerability and trust. Through the steady drumming of rain, Isabella suddenly became aware of approaching footsteps. Her body tensed, and immediately she felt the horse respond to her anxiety, its posture shifting slightly, but remaining non-threatening. The steps were different from Aurora's, lighter, more cautious, and they carried with them a sense of purpose rather than dismissal. The horse's reaction to the approaching figure surprised both Isabella and Helena. Instead of showing its usual aggression towards strangers, it maintained its protective stance while allowing Helena to draw closer. It was as if the animal could sense her genuine concern for Isabella's well-being, understanding that this visitor brought hope rather than harm. Time seemed to stand still as Helena finally reached the edge of the shelter. The rain created a curtain around them, isolating this moment from the rest of the world. She watched as Isabella's hand remained steady on the horse's neck, fingers tracing the scar that had become a symbol of their shared resilience. The trust between them was palpable, a force as real as the storm that raged around them. Without warning, a particularly loud crash of thunder shook the air. Isabella instinctively tightened her grip on the horse's mane, and the animal responded by drawing even closer, its body creating a more secure barrier against the elements. This simple interaction spoke volumes about the depth of their connection, a bond formed through mutual understanding and need. The silence between thunderclaps was filled with the sound of rain and heavy breathing, the horse's steady rhythm and Helena's cautious approach. Isabella's fingers remained entwined in the horse's mane, drawing comfort from its familiar presence as she tried to identify the newcomer. The air carried a different energy now, charged with something beyond the storm's electricity. "Isabella," Helena's voice cut through the rain's constant drumming, gentle but clear. The sound of her name, spoken with such kindness after hours of silence, made Isabella's breath catch in her throat. The horse shifted slightly, adjusting its position to accommodate this new presence while maintaining its protective stance. "Helena?" Isabella's voice wavered with uncertainty and hope. She recognized the voice from the village, remembered the kind words Helena had often spoken in passing, the small gestures of friendship that had stood out in her isolated world. "How did you find me?" Helena moved closer, careful to telegraph her movements for both Isabella and the horse's benefit. The rain had plastered her clothes to her skin, but she barely noticed the discomfort. Her focus was entirely on the extraordinary scene before her, the gentle giant that had become an unlikely guardian, and the young woman who had somehow formed a bond with it that defied all expectations. "I noticed things weren't right," Helena explained, her voice carrying notes of both anger and relief. "Your mother's story didn't make sense. I followed the tracks, followed my instincts." She paused, watching as the horse gently nudged Isabella's shoulder, as if reassuring her of its continued presence. "I never expected to find this." The storm continued to rage around them, but within their shelter, a different kind of energy began to build. Helena observed the way the horse responded to Isabella's every movement, how it seemed to anticipate her needs before she expressed them. This wasn't just an animal tolerating human presence. This was something deeper, something that spoke of understanding and trust. "He's been protecting me," Isabella said softly, her hand finding the familiar scar on the horse's neck. Everyone said he was dangerous, but he understood. He knew what it was like to be misunderstood, to be feared. Her words carried years of pain, of isolation, of the loneliness that had been her constant companion. Helena moved closer still, now able to see clearly the changes that had taken place in both Isabella and the horse. The animal that had once been known for its fierce temperament now showed a gentleness that seemed to transform its very nature. And Isabella, despite her ordeal, carried herself with a new kind of strength, born from the unexpected connection she had formed. "Your mother," Helena began, but Isabella shook her head, cutting off the words she didn't want to hear. The horse responded to her distress, shifting its weight slightly, creating a more solid barrier between her and the painful truth of her abandonment. The action wasn't aggressive, merely protective, and Helena felt a surge of amazement at the animal's intuitive understanding. The rain began to ease, its rhythm softening from a roar to a gentle patter. In this moment of relative quiet, Helena shared what she had discovered. The inconsistencies in Aurora's story, the villagers' growing suspicions, the trail that had led her here. With each word, she watched Isabella's expression shift, not toward despair as she had feared, but toward a kind of peaceful acceptance. "I'm not going back," Isabella said firmly, her voice stronger than Helena had ever heard it. "Not to that house, not to that life." Her fingers tightened in the horse's mane, and the animal stood perfectly still, as if lending its strength to her declaration. "For the first time, I've found something real, something true." Helena looked at the unlikely pair, the blind girl in her wheelchair and the horse that everyone had deemed untamable, and saw something miraculous. In their shared isolation, they had found a connection that transcended their limitations, their fears, their past experiences. It was a bond formed through understanding, through the recognition of shared pain and the possibility of healing. The storm's fury had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. Drops of water fell from leaves and branches, creating a gentle symphony that seemed to celebrate this moment of truth and revelation. Helena knew that what she had discovered here would change everything, not just for Isabella, but for the entire village that had allowed this situation to develop. The dawn broke over the village with a different kind of light, the air clean and fresh after the storm. Helena had spent the night in the enclosure with Isabella and her equine protector, unable and unwilling to leave them alone. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the remaining clouds, she watched the extraordinary bond between girl and horse continue to unfold before her eyes. During the night, Helena had witnessed countless small moments that spoke volumes about their connection. How the horse would shift its position whenever Isabella showed the slightest sign of discomfort, how it would gently nudge her hand when she seemed lost in troubled thoughts, how its presence seemed to give her a strength she had never shown before. These weren't the actions of a dangerous animal. They were the gestures of a soul that had found its purpose in protecting another. "We need to make some arrangements," Helena said softly, as she watched Isabella run her fingers through the horse's mane, a morning ritual that seemed to calm them both. "You're right. You can't go back to that house, but we need to ensure your safety and comfort." The horse's ears pricked forward at her words, as if understanding the importance of the conversation. Isabella nodded, her face turned toward the warmth of the rising sun. "I won't leave him," she said firmly, her hand resting on the horse's neck where the scar had become a symbol of their shared resilience. "He's not just an animal to me anymore. He's—" She paused, searching for words to describe the profound connection they shared. "I understand," Helena replied, and she did. She had seen enough during the night to know that separating Isabella from the horse would be like trying to separate the sun from its light. They had formed something rare and precious, a bond that had transformed them both. The horse that everyone had feared had become a gentle guardian, while Isabella had found a confidence and peace that had always been denied her. Back in the village, rumor of Isabella's disappearance had begun to spread like wildfire. Aurora's carefully constructed story was unraveling thread by thread as more villagers came forward with their observations. The strange direction her cart had taken, the unusual supplies she had purchased, the way she avoided direct questions about her daughter's whereabouts. Helena knew she had to act quickly, but carefully. She made her way back to the village, promising Isabella she would return soon. The horse stood guard, as always, its powerful presence a guarantee of Isabella's safety in her absence. The trust in Isabella's face as Helena left showed how much had changed in just one night. She was no longer the isolated, fearful girl she had been. In the village, Helena began to set her plan in motion. Her first stop was at her own home, a cozy cottage on the outskirts of the village. She gathered blankets, fresh clothes, and food, her mind working through the logistics of what needed to be done. The situation required delicate handling, not just for Isabella's sake, but for the horses as well. As she moved through the village gathering supplies, Helena carefully observed Aurora's house. The woman had become a virtual recluse since abandoning her daughter, drawing curtains against questioning eyes and avoiding direct contact with neighbors. The weight of her actions seemed to be pressing down on her, visible in her furtive movements and haunted expressions. The villagers, who had long turned a blind eye to Aurora's treatment of Isabella, now found themselves confronting their own complicity in the situation. Many approached Helena with questions, concerns, and offers of help, though she was careful not to reveal too much about Isabella's whereabouts. The community was awakening to its responsibility, but Helena knew that trust needed to be rebuilt slowly and carefully. Back at the enclosure, Isabella's world was expanding in ways she had never imagined possible. Without the constant pressure of her mother's disapproval, she began to explore her surroundings with new confidence. The horse remained her constant companion, its presence both protective and encouraging. Together they created a space where disability wasn't a limitation, but simply a different way of experiencing the world. Helena returned to find Isabella exactly where she had left her, but somehow changed. There was a peace about her that seemed to radiate from within, a strength that came from knowing she was truly cared for. The horse's gentle nickering at Helena's approach seemed to welcome her into their private world, acknowledging her role in their story. As the days passed, the old enclosure began to transform under Helena's careful attention. What had once been a place of abandonment became a sanctuary, not just for Isabella and her equine guardian, but for a new kind of healing. Helena had brought basic comforts, a sheltered area with proper bedding, fresh supplies, and most importantly, the warmth of genuine care and concern. The horse's behavior continued to amaze everyone who witnessed it. The animal that had once been feared throughout the village now moved with extraordinary gentleness around Isabella's wheelchair, its powerful body always positioned to provide support or protection as needed. The infamous temper that had made it unapproachable was now reserved solely for moments when unknown visitors approached too quickly or with uncertain intentions. Isabella's world, which had once been confined to the walls of her mother's house, expanded with each passing day. She learned to navigate the enclosure with increasing confidence, guided by the subtle sounds of the horse's movements and the different textures beneath her wheelchair. The fresh air and sunshine brought color to her cheeks, and her voice, once timid and hesitant, grew stronger with each passing day. "The ground feels different here," Isabella explained to Helena one morning, her fingers trailing through the horse's mane. "I can tell where I am by the way the wheels move over the earth, by the way sounds echo off the fences. It's like having a map in my mind, one that grows clearer every day." The horse nickered softly, as if affirming her words. Helena watched in wonder as Isabella demonstrated her new understanding of her environment. The girl who had been treated as helpless now showed remarkable spatial awareness, aided by her partnership with the horse. When she needed to move in a new direction, the horse would guide her with gentle nudges, teaching her the safest paths through their shared space. Word of the extraordinary bond between Isabella and the horse began to spread through the village, drawing curious but respectful visitors. Helena carefully screened each one, protective of the healing that was taking place in the enclosure. Those who were allowed to witness the unique partnership often left with tears in their eyes and a new understanding of what it meant to truly care for another being. The horse's scar, which Isabella had first discovered during their initial encounter, became a topic of much discussion among the visitors. Village elders remembered how the animal had received the injury, defending a younger horse from a falling beam during a storm. This revelation cast new light on its supposedly aggressive nature. It had always been protective, not violent. "He wasn't mean," Isabella told the visitors, her hand resting on the horse's neck. "He was trying to tell us something, but no one understood his language. Sometimes being misunderstood can make you seem dangerous." Her words carried the weight of personal experience, touching hearts and changing perspectives throughout the community. Helena noticed other changes too, subtle but significant shifts in how the villagers spoke about disability and difference. The sight of Isabella confidently navigating her world with the help of her unlikely companion challenged long-held assumptions about limitations and capabilities. People began to question their own prejudices, their own roles in maintaining barriers they had never thought to question before. The horse's dedication to Isabella never wavered. It learned to anticipate her needs with an almost supernatural accuracy, knowing when she needed water, when she needed shade, when she needed the simple comfort of its presence. Their communication transcended ordinary understanding, becoming something that spoke to the deepest truths about connection and trust. Even the local children, who had once been warned to stay far from the horse's enclosure, began to see something magical in the partnership between Isabella and her guardian. Under Helena's careful supervision, they would bring treats for both Isabella and the horse, learning valuable lessons about patience, kindness, and the many ways love could bridge seemingly impossible gaps. As the sun began to set on another day in their evolving story, Helena watched Isabella and the horse in their evening routine. The girl's hands moved with confident familiarity over the horse's coat, checking for any signs of discomfort or tension. The animal stood perfectly still, occasionally turning its head to gently nuzzle her shoulder, their trust in each other absolute and unconditional. The transformation that had begun in the old enclosure started to ripple outward through the village like waves in a pond. What had started as a story of abandonment was becoming a powerful lesson in understanding and acceptance. The villagers, who had once turned away from Isabella's situation, now found themselves drawn to the extraordinary partnership they witnessed between her and the horse. Aurora's house stood silent and dark, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a community that had begun to see through her deceptions. The weight of her actions pressed heavily upon her shoulders, visible in her increasingly haggard appearance and furtive movements. She had become a shadow of herself, haunted by the consequences of her choices and the whispers that followed her through the village streets. Helena had noticed how the other villagers now avoided Aurora's gaze, their silence more condemning than any words could be. The woman who had once held her head high, justifying her treatment of Isabella with cold logic, now hurried through the village with downcast eyes. The truth of her actions had stripped away her carefully maintained facade, leaving her exposed to the judgment she had always feared. At the enclosure, Isabella's world continued to expand in wonderful and unexpected ways. The horse had become not just her protector, but her teacher, helping her discover new ways to navigate and understand her environment. Together, they had developed a language of touch and movement that went beyond words, a communication so profound it left visitors in awe. "Watch how they move together," Helena explained to a group of fascinated villagers. "The horse doesn't just guide her, it responds to her. They've created their own way of understanding each other." The visitors watched as Isabella and the horse demonstrated this silent dialogue, the animal adjusting its movements to match her needs with extraordinary precision. The children of the village had become regular visitors, drawn by the magical connection they witnessed. Under Helena's watchful eye, they brought carrots and apples, learning to approach both Isabella and the horse with gentle respect. Isabella's patience in teaching them about her world, about how she experienced life through sound and touch, opened young minds to new ways of understanding. "Close your eyes," she would tell them, "and listen to how the world speaks to you. Feel how the ground changes beneath your feet, how the air moves differently in different spaces." The children would follow her instructions, discovering with wonder how rich the world could be when experienced through other senses. The horse's reputation in the village underwent a complete transformation. The animal that had once been feared was now seen as a symbol of loyalty and understanding. Its gentleness with Isabella, contrasted with its protective alertness when needed, demonstrated an intelligence and emotional depth that challenged everyone's preconceptions about the nature of animals. As autumn approached, bringing cooler winds and changing leaves, the enclosure had evolved into something no one could have predicted. Helena had overseen the addition of comfortable shelters and amenities, But more importantly, it had become a place of healing and learning. People came not just to visit Isabella and the horse, but to learn from their example of unconditional acceptance and trust. Aurora's isolation grew deeper with each passing day. The villagers who had once supported her story about Isabella's treatment facility now avoided her entirely. Her house, once a prison for Isabella, had become her own self-imposed cage. The irony of this reversal was not lost on the community, though they spoke of it only in whispers. The horse's protective instincts never wavered, but they evolved to accommodate the positive changes in their lives. While still cautious with newcomers, it seemed to understand the difference between curious visitors and potential threats. Its behavior became a model of discerning care, gentle when gentleness was needed, firm when protection was required. Isabella's confidence grew stronger with each interaction. She began to share her story with visitors, helping them understand how her partnership with the horse had shown her new possibilities in life. "We all have different ways of seeing the world," she would explain, her hand resting on the horse's neck near the familiar scar. "Sometimes what we think of as limitations can become doorways to understanding something deeper." The autumn winds brought change to the village, painting the trees in brilliant colors and carrying whispers of transformation through its streets. The old enclosure, once a place of abandonment, had become a sanctuary that drew people from neighboring villages, all curious to witness the extraordinary bond between Isabella and her equine guardian. The story of their connection had spread far beyond the village boundaries, touching hearts and changing perspectives wherever it was told. Helena had watched this transformation with a mixture of joy and amazement. The place she had discovered in that stormy night had evolved into something far more significant than a simple shelter. It had become a center of learning where people came to understand that differences weren't limitations, but rather unique ways of experiencing the world. Aurora's life had become a stark contrast to the vibrancy of the enclosure. Her house, once a symbol of her control over Isabella's world, now stood as a monument to her isolation. The curtains remained drawn, and she emerged only when necessary, a ghost of her former self. The weight of her actions had transformed her from a woman who commanded respect through fear into someone who could barely meet the eyes of her neighbors. One crisp morning, as Isabella sat with her hand resting on the horse's neck, she heard familiar footsteps approaching, footsteps she hadn't heard since that day of abandonment. The horse tensed slightly beneath her touch, but remained calm. Sensing no immediate threat, Aurora had finally found the courage, or perhaps the desperation, to face what she had done. Helena, who had been helping Isabella arrange fresh hay in the shelter, straightened up as she saw Aurora's figure at the entrance to the enclosure. The woman who had once held herself with such rigid pride now seemed smaller, diminished by the truth she could no longer avoid. The whispers in the village had become too loud, the weight of her deception too heavy to bear. The horse's reaction surprised everyone present. Instead of showing aggression toward Aurora, it maintained its protective stance near Isabella while displaying a calm that seemed to acknowledge the importance of this moment. Its eyes, which had once been described as wild and dangerous, now held a wisdom that surpassed human understanding. Isabella's voice broke the tense silence. "I can hear your breathing, Mother," she said softly, her hand steady on the horse's neck. "It's different now." The simple observation carried years of understanding of how fear and resentment could change a person, and how facing the truth could begin to transform them. The gathered villagers, who had become regular visitors to the enclosure, watched in respectful silence. They had witnessed Isabella's growth from a hidden, isolated girl into someone who taught them daily lessons about courage and connection. Her relationship with the horse had shown them that true understanding transcended conventional boundaries. Aurora took a hesitant step forward, then another. The horse's ears flickered, but it remained steady, as if recognizing that this moment was crucial for Isabella's healing. The animal that everyone had once feared now demonstrated a depth of emotional intelligence that left the onlookers in awe. "The world didn't end when you left me here," Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger. "It began. For the first time, I found someone who saw me for who I am, not for what I couldn't do." Her words carried no bitterness, only a calm certainty that spoke of hard-won wisdom and unexpected grace. The transformation of the enclosure reflected the deeper changes that had occurred. What had been intended as a place of abandonment had become a space of healing and learning. The fresh hay, the new shelters, the worn paths that Isabella navigated with confidence, all spoke of a life that had flourished despite, or perhaps because of, the challenges it had faced. Helena watched as Aurora struggled to find words to bridge the gulf her actions had created. The woman who had once been so quick to justify her coldness now stood speechless before the evidence of her daughter's strength. The horse, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, gently pressed its nose against Isabella's shoulder, offering its steady presence as support. The morning air hung heavy with unspoken words as Aurora stood before her daughter. The enclosure, usually filled with the gentle sounds of daily activities, had fallen into a respectful silence. Even the birds seemed to pause their songs, as if understanding the significance of this moment. The horse remained steadfast beside Isabella, its powerful presence both protective and reassuring. "I see now." Aurora's voice trembled, breaking the silence. "I see what I couldn't or wouldn't see before." Her words carried the weight of countless sleepless nights and lonely days, of a truth that had become impossible to ignore. The villagers who had gathered watched with bated breath as years of misunderstanding hung in the balance. Isabella's hand remained steady on the horse's neck, drawing strength from its unwavering presence. "What do you see, Mother?" she asked, her voice clear and confident, so different from the timid whispers that had once filled their house. The horse shifted slightly, positioning itself to better support her as she faced this crucial moment. "I see strength where I only saw weakness," Aurora replied, her composure cracking. "I see capability where I only saw limitations. I see—" She paused, struggling with emotions she had suppressed for so long. "I see you, Isabella. Really see you, perhaps for the first time." Helena stood nearby, ready to intervene if needed, but something in the scene told her to wait. The horse's calm demeanor suggested that this confrontation was necessary, part of a healing process that had begun that stormy night of abandonment. Its eyes, once deemed wild and dangerous, now watched the interaction with an almost human understanding. "This place," Isabella gestured to the enclosure around her, "that you chose as my punishment became my liberation. Here I found something I never had at home, acceptance." The horse gently nuzzled her shoulder, emphasizing her words. "He saw past my disabilities, past what everyone thought I couldn't do. He saw me." The transformation in Isabella was evident to everyone present. The girl who had once been hidden away now spoke with quiet authority, her words carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. The villagers who had come to know her over the past months nodded in recognition of the truth in her words. Aurora took another step forward, her movements hesitant but determined. The horse's ears flickered, but it remained calm, seemingly understanding the importance of this moment. "The village has changed," Aurora said softly. "Or perhaps I'm the one who's changed. Watching from my windows, I've seen how people come here now, not out of pity or fear, but to learn." Isabella's fingers found the familiar scar on the horse's neck, drawing comfort from this testament to survival and healing. "We both had to learn new ways of seeing," she replied. "He taught me that what others see as flaws can become strengths." That sometimes the greatest understanding comes when we stop trying to change each other. The morning sun had risen higher, casting warm light across the enclosure. The space that had once been meant for breaking spirits had become a place where spirits were mended. The fresh hay, the worn paths, the new shelters, everything spoke of care and purpose, of a life reclaimed and redefined. I was wrong. Aurora's words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Wrong in ways I'm only beginning to understand. The treatment facility I claimed to send you to, it was a lie born of shame and fear. But you found real healing here, with him. She gestured toward the horse, whose gentle presence seemed to embody the truth of her words. The gathered villagers witnessed something profound in that moment, not just a mother's acknowledgement of her mistakes, but a community's recognition of its own transformation. Through Isabella and her extraordinary partnership with the horse, they had all learned to see beyond surface appearances, to understand that strength could wear many faces. The seasons had turned full circle since that fateful day of abandonment, and the old enclosure had transformed into something magical. What had begun as a place of isolation had become a sanctuary of healing, not just for Isabella and her equine guardian, but for the entire community. The story of their extraordinary bond had touched hearts far beyond the village boundaries, teaching lessons about love, acceptance, and the power of understanding. Aurora's admission of her mistakes had marked the beginning of a slow but steady healing process. While the past couldn't be erased, new foundations were being built on the ruins of old misunderstandings. The village had witnessed not just Isabella's transformation, but its own evolution into a more compassionate and understanding community. The horse, once feared for its untamable spirit, had become a symbol of profound wisdom and loyalty. Its protective nature, once misunderstood as aggression, was now recognized as a pure expression of love and dedication. The scar that Isabella had first discovered had become a testament to their shared journey of healing and growth. Helena had overseen the enclosure's development into a place of learning and connection. People came from neighboring villages to witness the extraordinary partnership between Isabella and the horse, leaving with new perspectives on ability, disability, and the many ways love could bridge seemingly impossible gaps. Every touch has a meaning, Isabella explained to a group of visiting children, her hand resting on the horse's neck. Every sound tells a story. When we learn to listen with our hearts, we discover that there are many ways to see the world. The horse stood perfectly still, its presence amplifying her words with silent wisdom. The village itself had undergone a profound transformation. The whispers that had once carried judgment and fear now spoke of wonder and respect. Isabella and her horse had shown them that true strength often came in unexpected forms, and that understanding could flourish in the most unlikely places. Aurora, though still carrying the weight of her past actions, had begun to find her own path to redemption. She now spent time at the enclosure, not as a controlling presence, but as a quiet observer of the miracle her daughter had created from what was meant to be punishment. The horse, displaying its remarkable emotional intelligence, had gradually accepted her presence, seeming to understand the importance of forgiveness in healing old wounds. As the sun set on another day at the sanctuary, casting long shadows across the well-worn paths, Isabella sat with her hand on the horse's neck, feeling the strong, steady pulse of life beneath her fingers. The scar that had first connected them remained a constant reminder of their journey, how pain could lead to understanding, and rejection could open doors to acceptance. "We all have scars," she would tell visitors, "some visible, some hidden. But it's not the scars that define us. It's how we heal, how we grow, and who we choose to become." The horse would nicker softly at these words, as if affirming their shared wisdom. The enclosure had become more than a home. It was a living testament to the power of unconditional love and acceptance. Children who once feared differences now came eagerly to learn from Isabella's unique way of experiencing the world. Adults who had held firm beliefs about limitations found themselves questioning long-held assumptions. In the end, what had begun as a story of abandonment had transformed into a powerful tale of discovery and redemption. Isabella and her horse had shown that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as challenges, and that true understanding often requires us to look beyond what our eyes can see. Dear listeners, as our hearts beat in rhythm with this extraordinary tale of healing and hope, we invite you to join us on more journeys of discovery. The story of Isabella and her remarkable guardian reminds us that love knows no boundaries, and understanding comes in many forms. For more inspiring stories that celebrate the triumph of the human spirit, click the subscribe button on your left. If this story touched your heart, please share your thoughts in the comments below and give us a thumbs up. Remember, every day brings new stories of courage, connection, and the incredible bonds that can form between souls who truly understand each other. Stay tuned for more tales that will open your heart and change how you see the world. We'll be waiting to hear your thoughts in the comments.